Hello, everyone. Thank you for Ideagen for organizing the 7 days of sustainability. I'm so glad to be here with my colleague, Torbjörn Fredriksson, head of e-commerce of digital economy branch at UNCTAD. Hello, Torbjörn. How are you?
Hello, Chantal Line. It's great to be with you. It's nice to reconnect from Geneva to New York.
Exactly. We need more of those cross-Atlantic connections. So let's go right into this. So everyone on this video, you've heard our Secretary General, and you've heard it from me many times, that we can't achieve the SDGs unless we all work together and break the silos, right? And this is reflected in SDG 17, which most people recognize as partnership, like the one with Ideagen to empower women and girls. And however, what most people do not understand, and Torbjörn and I want to dive in today, is that as the SDGs is more than partnership. It's also the means of implementation to achieve the SDGs. And that's UN jargon for trade, investment, finance, technology, capacity building. These are the enablers of economic development, and they are, if reformed, to have people and planet at their center, are enablers of sustainable development. So Torbjörn, as the economy is digitalizing, technology and e-commerce are becoming even more important. Why is e-commerce so important for developing countries?
Oh, no, it's important for the world in a sense right now, because as we see technology spreading more rapidly, both consumers and businesses look for their goods and services that they need to buy online. And our concern right now, if you want to have an inclusive development in the world as we move forward with digitalization, then all countries and all businesses and people around the world need to have the ability to participate in e-commerce. If you don't have that capability and your clients are going online to buy whatever they want, you will be invisible in the market. So it has long-term implications of economic growth, job opportunities, etc.
And a real risk of leaving countries behind, right? If these companies don't get on the digital e-commerce?
No, it's very true. And we want to see digitalization as a way to bridge the divides, a way to achieve less inequalities in the world. But as things go right now, there is a huge risk that we will rather see greater inequalities, because technology is evolving very fast. And if you don't have the readiness to make use of these opportunities, then you risk falling further behind. And this has been further accentuated by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Indeed. But even before the COVID-19, Torbjörn, you had the idea of doing something about it in the spirit of partnership and trade and investment and technology. So tell us, how did you come up with this idea of creating this partnership on e-trade for all to address this issue?
Yeah, thanks for asking. And it's a question that we have been receiving repeatedly, because we see growing interest in how to really improve digital cooperation. This is a high up on the agenda of the UN Secretary General with his roadmap on digital cooperation. But let me go back to 2015, when we published in UNCTAD the Information Economy Report 2015, which focused entirely on how to make e-commerce more inclusive for development. And we did this was like a landmark publication, and we really went through all the existing research. We looked at the extent to which people and businesses were engaging in e-commerce around the world, and we spotted a huge divide. And this divide very much exists still today. We can see, for instance, in the most advanced economies in terms of e-commerce use, 80% of the people are buying things online. And in the least developed countries of the world, then that share is typically 5% or less. So it's a huge difference. So then we started looking at what do you need to have in place in order to be able to participate effectively in e-commerce. And we saw that there were a range of policy areas that needed to be addressed. Everything from having a clear idea in the government, having a clear strategy for improving things in the country. You needed to have payment solutions that were suitable for e-commerce. You needed to adapt the infrastructure so that you could reach not only the urban centers, but the rural areas that needed to be affordable and reliable. You needed trade facilitation solutions that could cope with small packages coming in large volume to the customs authorities, which were used to handling big containers with a small number of shippers. You needed to have the legal and regulatory framework in place that could address data protection and privacy, consumer protection online, etc. You needed to have the skills, both in the business context, but also in the government to formulate the right policies and to take advantage of digital opportunities. And you also needed to have effective financing for the enterprises that wanted to build their new business models around e-commerce and digital opportunities.
So you couldn't do that in silo, right?
No, but then that's the point. When you look then at telling the government, you need to act on all this, they realized, oops, this means that we are having to involve many different ministries, many different government agencies. And if you then look at how the world is organized when it comes to the international levels, we have typically had international organizations that are linked to these ministries. So they're all silos from the national level all the way up to the global level. So UNCTAD, for instance, we are a little bit of an odd animal in this sense because we cover many different policy areas. But our primary entry point into governments is the Ministry of Trade or Ministry of Commerce. In our colleagues in ITU, in the International Telecommunication Union, they mainly did with the ministries of ICT and so on and so forth. Whereas digital is relevant for all the SDGs, for all the development areas. So we thought, no matter how good UNCTAD would be in providing assistance to our member states, we could never cover all the areas because we don't have the expertise and the experience. So we said, we need to identify the most important partners in the world that can provide support to developing countries to speed up and provide more effective support to developing countries in the area of e-commerce. So we decided to meet up with a number of partners, with a few donor organizations, with a few member states that were seeking assistance, and some private sector partners to see how could we work together in a much more effective way than just continuing running in silos, sometimes ending up doing the same things in the same countries, and the poor member states had to deal with all these international organizations that wanted to be partners. So we created eTrade for All. Originally, this initiative had 14 partners, players like the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, UNCTAD, ITU, the regional commissions of the UN, and a few more. The simple idea was that let's create a digital platform where countries that need assistance from international organizations can look at the 7 policy areas that we had identified as particularly important, and they would find out who can offer what. And through one entry point, they could get access to all these different stakeholders. Today, we're 34 organizations that are supporting these efforts. And we have learned so much from each other. And we have found new ways of delivering activities in developing countries. And we have started now also to share knowledge and research, for instance, on the implications of COVID-19 on e-commerce and what you can do about it. It's been tremendously valuable. And I think it's something that other parts of the development community could learn from. Still developing, we're still improving, and there's still much more to be done.
And it's fascinating, Torbjörn, because both me and you have had this experience where everybody wants to go alone. I don't know if it's our ego, if it's and this transaction cost, right? Maybe you tell us, like, how long did it take you? Because people would say, "Oh, it's so long to go and talk to them. I'll just try to wipe up people and do it myself." How long did it take you? Where were the roadblock? And how did you convince those that didn't want to play with you and wanted to do their own thing?
This report that I mentioned in 2015 was very important. It was very well received by member states and also by our partners. So they saw that there is something going here. We would like to be part of this. We brought together in February 2016, these stakeholders that I was talking about, the donors, the private sector, our partners in the international organizations, together to start brainstorming what could this kind of initiative focus on, and what would be the core elements, and what could the different partners bring to the table, and how can we make this work.
And that's probably key, Torbjörn, right? So you didn't cook the whole pot, you didn't cook the whole thing, and then brought it all cooked up to partner and say, sign on, right?
Yes.
So I think sometimes people don't realize that.
The key is not only did we break the silos from our peers in the development community, from day one, we involved the private sector, the beneficiary countries, and the donor community, so that you can bring in the different perspectives. Donors were also worried initially, isn't this just going to create a big trust fund that will put a lot of money and we will be uncertain about what the end result will be? One thing we said from the beginning, this had to be an initiative that everyone could feel ownership of. So when you look today at eTrade for All and the logo that we're using, you will not see the UN, you will not see UNCTAD anywhere, even though we are taking the lead in this initiative. And I think that has also helped, that we have from day one not tried to boast about UNCTAD as such, but really our common efforts to try to do something differently. And breaking down silos is difficult because typically all these organizations are reaching out to the same donor organizations to try to get funding for what they do. But if we can say that if you give us funding, we can work with all the other partners in the same way, then it becomes much more appealing to the donors as well.
So you said there's the report, the Digital Economy Report 2015, which was our first one, right, on digital economy?
I'm afraid no. We have been writing about this for 20 years in UNCTAD, but it was in that particular report, we were looking specifically at e-commerce, and that was really serving as a foundation for the work that followed.
So the bottom line is science is very important. Having the right information, science-based information to be able to make this decision was it seems instrumental to convince at least the donors, right? Yeah. And others.
Yeah, and then we were lucky in a sense with the timing, because soon around that time, there was a growing interest in the World Trade Organization also to reinvigorate discussions on e-commerce in the context of trade negotiations. So there was a strong interest from a lot of member states to have availability of more evidence, more data, more knowledge to feed into these processes.
Excellent. So what would you say was the hardest thing in creating this is a big initiative now, right? Maybe you told us now we have 34 partners. How many member states are using it? How much money have donors put in to help countries?
Well, I mean, it is not a very costly endeavor right now. We're getting funding mainly from the Netherlands, from Germany, and from more recently from Switzerland to support this platform. We had originally some seed funding also from Sweden and from the UK. But it basically covers the cost of having 2 staff to manage the digital platform and to foster the interaction with all the members of this organization. The hardest
is a very lean operation.
It's a very lean operation. It's very lean. And the eTrade for All initiative is not doling out funds or anything like that. It's just a mechanism to make it easier to navigate the system of all these different organizations. And then, of course, all the organizations, they raise funding for their own activity, as do we. And in some areas, we are the leader in terms of supporting member states. In others, it could be ITU, could be the World Bank, could be International Trade Center, etc. And they raise their own funding. But
go ahead, Torbjörn.
No, go ahead.
So you say UNCTAD takes the lead on some of them. Could you tell us? You said there's 7 areas. So which area is UNCTAD taking the lead on?
Right. So we are very active on the first cluster sort of activities, meaning helping countries to assess where they stand right now and what they can do to improve situation in a broad sense.
That's our e-readiness assessment. Is that
exactly
correct?
That has become one of the core tools, and I don't think that would have been created unless we had etrade for all in the beginning. So the etrade for all is the 7 policy areas that we're looking at there, also is the foundation for the etrade readiness assessments. We've done 27 such assessments now, 25 of which are for the least developed countries. They generate like a matrix of actions in all these 7 policy areas that governments with partners can act upon. So it's not just doing the assessment, it's also to follow up and see how we can actually implement together with the governments and other stakeholders these recommendations. And one recommendation that almost always comes up is that there is a need to formulate a proper strategy in the government. And that is important not just to identify what to do, but who should do it. And often to create some kind of interministerial function that can enable this cross-ministerial interaction. But very often in this area, when we come in and start consulting with member states, it's the first time that the government sit down with the private sector related to e-commerce. So they get to know each other, and that creates a new channel of private-public dialogue that doesn't exist normally in these countries.
That's interesting. So
I'll just mention a few more areas, just quickly. We also help countries improve their legislation in key areas for e-commerce. We help countries improving the measurement of e-commerce and the digital economy, which is extremely important. The rich countries, they have data. They know whether their policies are having an effect. But in most developing countries, such data don't exist. And that means that they are basically formulating and monitoring their policies blindfolded. Another area that we have done increasingly much work in the past couple of years is what we call eTrade for Women, and to really boost and support and empower the women digital entrepreneurs in developing countries. Let me pose a question to you, Chantal Line.
Yes.
So if I ask you to name the top 3 women in e-commerce in the global economy, who would they be? I'm sure you can mention Jeff Bezos, and you'll talk about Mark Zuckerberg, and you will talk about all these Jack Ma people and so on all around the world. But who are the women?
Well, I would be able to answer because I know, thanks to you and your colleagues, we have the eTrade for Women advocates. So we know we have 6 of them around the world. But it is true, but we're lacking these Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg on the women's side. So please, I'm going to put a question later on the role of the private sector. But I want us to deep dive, because IdeaGen is also working on economic empowerment of women and girls in the digital space as well. So our audience here will be very, very keen on this. So I want to know, we know that, typically if you don't go explicitly try to reach women, it doesn't happen, right? How do you make that connection? When did you realize, okay, we have eTrade for all, but now women, we need to do something special for women?
No, but it's very clear. You don't need to look hard for that, because the gender divide is very, very tangible in the e-commerce and digital economy context. And unfortunately, the gender divide, even if you start at the level of just using the internet, it is particularly striking in the low-income countries, in LDCs and in Africa. That's why you see the widest gender divide. But what is more worrying, perhaps, is not just who is using the internet, but who is actually involved in the production of digital services and goods. And here, if you go to the universities, who is actually enrolled in the programs that will lead you to a career in the digital economy, it's a very low ratio. In most countries, there are exceptions, but there are typically very small shares of women involved. And if you go to the best conferences on artificial intelligence and so on around the world, the share of women participating in this is typically very limited. If you go to the top management positions in the biggest corporations in this sector, they are mainly occupied by men. And we felt what is needed is to really not just focus on those that can use technologies, but can actually create value, create new businesses, create more jobs. And that goes back to the entrepreneurs. Once you start looking for that, there are some amazing women that have created amazing businesses that are doing really well. And we have set that as a criteria that you have to be a founder of a digital business, and it has to have been up and running for at least 5 years. So it has a track record. And these people, of course, need to have an interest in not just doing good for themselves, but also sharing with other potentially very powerful women digital entrepreneurs. And it's been a fantastic journey so far. It's only 2 years old. Actually, you and I were together when we launched this in New York during the General Assembly 2 years ago.
Indeed. A different world then, Torbjörn, right?
Yeah, totally. We didn't have the COVID then.
Exactly. And I remember, Torbjörn, the reception by everyone. It was like, it's so obvious. It's almost one of those, like etrade for women, and having these 6 advocates. These women were so accomplished and so empowering for young women and in their region. And to see people, and it was almost like, why didn't somebody think about this before? But tell us a bit more about our 6 advocates, because they're just, I was just so impressed by them.
Yeah, so we have selected them with those criteria, and we also want to try to cover all the parts of the developing world in a sense. So we have Nina Angelovska, for instance, from North Macedonia, who is the founder of Grouper.mk. It was really the biggest and the first successful e-commerce platform in that country. And she felt that this is not enough to run the business. I need to make sure that I can also improve the business environment for e-commerce in my country. So she founded the e-commerce association in that country, North Macedonia. And after that, right after we had appointed her to be the E-Trade for Women advocate for the Balkans, she became the Minister of Finance in her country. So she really was able to connect both the business perspective, the policy advocacy, and also then actually being in government. She has since left, and she's now just focusing on the business again.
Right. And this is her second time, right? That she's going to be an advocate.
Yeah, she stayed on for a second year.
Yeah. And I love the fact that you're with her, it's so evident, the link between the policy changes that need to happen and the entrepreneurship, and that connection you made, very direct.
Yeah. And this is the kind of what we try to do here. We want these advocates to act as role models for other women in the digital business or in other areas as well. And we want them to organize what we call masterclasses. So we invite between 15 and 30 women digital entrepreneurs from that region, and we bring them together, and they have a program where they talk about how to succeed well in this area. And the advocate is very much the inspiration and leader of those masterclasses. We were thinking about, a masterclass when you have a great violinist that will train the up-and-coming violinists, and with that idea. Then another thing is really to connect with the policy-making process, both in the countries where they are active, but also globally. So these are very accomplished women. So they stand in front of presidents or prime ministers or other ministers, and they listen because they have a good story to tell. So we have, in addition to North Macedonia, we have one advocate in Rwanda, one in Cote d'Ivoire. We have now one in Ecuador, one in Indonesia, and we have one in the United Arab Emirates. So we cover both Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Central Asia.
And French-speaking and English-speaking Africa as well. Exactly. To do these masterclass, and also they help you identify the women entrepreneur in their region, right?
Yeah, so and they have their own networks that we can tap into. Yes.
Right. So, we were talking about the private sector, and then, I'm very proud that UNCTAD at the country level is probably one of the organizations that work the most with the private sector in terms of bringing them to the table to make sure policy makes sense. Mm-hmm. What do we need from where you stand, right? We already have these partnerships. What can the technology sector do? What would two things that if you were to sit with them, because they're listening to this right now, what is it that they can do to help us scale this thing and really have an impact?
Well, the private sector is a very big group of enterprises. So first of all, I think it's important to keep in mind that the private sector is not just the Fortune 500 companies that we have well represented in New York. It's very important that when we listen and engage with the private sector, we also listen to the smaller companies in developing countries. And that's what we can do at the country level when we do our assessment, when we do the consultations, when we do the strengthening of women entrepreneurs and so on, so that they can feed into us, but we can also give back to them. The problem for small businesses, because most companies in the digital sector in developing countries are relatively small, except for the big telecom operators, which are huge players in this sector. So if a traditional government is picking up the phone to speak to the IT sector, they call the telecom operator because they know who that is. But they may not know the software companies. They may not know the small e-commerce platforms and so on. And they are very important to have an access to policy making, because what they need may be very different from what the big ones need. The biggest players in the world, we should be clear that in the digital economy now, we have 7 companies that are very, very, very dominant. These are 5 platforms from the US and 2 platforms from China. These companies account for a very large share of most activities going on online, and their role is growing every year, and it has been accentuated during the pandemic when everyone turned digital and everyone was relying on solutions and the services that typically were provided by certain companies. So their role is very important in terms of giving back to society. They can share, of course, their perspectives. They are very active in sharing with policymakers. They are the biggest group of lobbyists right now, both in Washington and in Brussels. But it is important. It is something we need to keep an eye on, because the way things are going is moving towards them becoming even more powerful. And they're providing great services, often for free, but they're getting the data back. And that is what makes it a very profitable business.
And is there a risk of crowding out this capacity of a platform in these countries, that at national level, that might be more?
There is a huge risk of that, because there are enormous economies of scale in digital businesses. So what has typically happened is that in relatively small markets, you see some budding companies coming up, sometimes with venture capital from abroad, but they are relatively small. You have Jumia in Africa as an e-commerce platform. You also had a company called Souk that was founded in the United Arab Emirates. Once it reached a certain level, then it became an interesting target for an acquisition. So Amazon took it over.
Yeah.
In India, you had Flipkart. And once it grew big enough, it was competing with Amazon in India. Then Walmart stepped in to take it over. So it became a competition between Walmart and Amazon. There was a company called Lazada, and that was supported by venture capital from Europe. And once it reached a certain stage, it covered 6 countries in Southeast Asia. Alibaba stepped in and took it over. So there is a tendency of consolidation in this market. Yeah. And that is something we also need to keep an eye on, for instance, from competition policies, etc.
Consumer protection as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very important too.
And these are 2 areas that UNCTAD work on. Torbjörn, I think me and you could be talking about this for a long time, but we're cognizant of the time here. So maybe what's your next big thing? Like, where are you taking this? And second, if people on this video want to reach out and help or support, where could they go? We've already mentioned the DER, Digital Economy Report 2015. The eTrade for Women and eTrade for All. They can find those very easy online. But what else?
Okay. No, but let me just, since you mentioned the Digital Economy Report, it's timely. We're launching the 2021 edition on the 29th of September. And this will focus entirely on cross-border data and cross-border data flows and development. And as most of you know, the growth in the use of data and the platformization of the digital economy are the 2 key drivers of the digital economy. So, and the platforms and the data flows, they are going very much hand in hand. So I would very much encourage you to have a look at that. We'll be calling for new ways of governing this kind of data and data flows. But I think what is important also here is to see how the global community can do better. And it's still the case that not enough attention in the context of development assistance is given to digitalization. I think a lot of donors, a lot of organizations are struggling a little bit to organize their work to really take into account the implications of digitalization. And it will have such far-reaching implications for all the sustainable development goals that we simply need to help more countries prepare for this. It's not just opportunities, there are huge challenges as well, as we have discussed.
Yeah.
And that requires attention to institutional building, skills development, new laws and regulations, etc. Things that take time, and it costs money, and it requires expertise. And we want to help with that, and we need to partner even more, not least with the donor communities in this area.
And Torbjörn, remind me, this is statistics that I remember that Shamika, our director of technology and logistics, had brought. Was it 2% of the total assistance that goes to supporting digital capacity in developing countries? And I think it went down during the COVID or something. Like, help me here, because it made no sense to me.
I mean, there are no perfect data here, but we sometimes refer to the amount that is spent under aid for trade, because that is a link to the economic development a lot. And we have seen an upward trend until 2019. We don't have the 2020 data yet. These data come from the OECD. And we can see that now 2.7% of all aid for trade funding is linked to ICT. But that's 2.7%. It's not enough.
No.
In fact, if you go back 15 years ago, the share going to ICT was about 3%. So we haven't even reached that stage yet. And I think it should double at least in order to reflect the importance of digitalization. But another number is interesting also. Among these numbers that came out 1 or 2 years ago, but it was only 1% of all the funding by the multilateral development banks went to ICT, and most of that went to infrastructure. Not a lot in terms of assisting with the regulatory reform, etc., which is so important.
And it's we're only beginning. Yeah, the World Multilateral Development Bank, they also need to adapt to this new world. Well, Torbjörn, this was so much fun. I learned a lot again today. Every time I talk to you, I do learn. I hope that people with us have learned a lot, and we invite them to follow us for your launch soon of the 2021 Digital Economy Report. Which date again, Torbjörn?
29 September. There will be a very nice launch available for anyone who wants to follow it.
Excellent. Well, we want to thank IdeaGen for organizing this. Thank you, Torbjörn. And let's keep talking about this digitalization and the fear, if we don't act all together, of leaving countries and people behind if they're not online. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Same here.